Are you tired of all those hair loss treatments and products that claim to work but don't? My name's William Gaunitz, and I am your no frills, no BS certified trichologist that is going to help you understand how to tackle your hair loss and actually regrow hair. Welcome to today's episode of the Trichologist podcast. My name's William Gaunitz, certified trichologist and your host of the Trichologist podcast. Today, this episode is actually sponsored by Advanced Trichology, so go ahead and check that out. And today I'm going to get into the primary and the most focused reason for people's hair loss concerns. Really, this reason for hair loss has gotten a ton of press. And this reason for hair loss is what everybody thinks is actually happening to them, but it's not necessarily. So there are three reasons for hair loss, and that is DHT, nutrition, and inflammation. And so you might have all different varieties of different names for hair loss. So you could have telogen effluvium, alopecia areata, androgenetic alopecia, which is actually the technical term for DHT related loss, and they're all funneled into these categories. And so in the 20 years of doing this, knowing this, I hear so many times when people are asking me, hey, how do I fix DHT related loss? And what they're describing to me is actually not related to DHT at all, because they have more of a global diffuse thinning and something's going on that doesn't sound like it's DHT. And I say, how do you know? And they're like, oh, wasn't all hair loss caused by DHT? And the answer is no, it's certainly not. And it's actually a very easy reason to deal with. So you have to identify if you are dealing with DHT related loss. And I'm going to go into DHT a little bit because, what is DHT? Well, DHT is dihydrotestosterone. So it's literally a single molecule different than testosterone. So it's basically testosterone with an extra hydrogen molecule. And the difference is that there are hormone receptors inside your body that actually sort of open up different mechanisms within your body. So if you have the hormone DHT, and you would actually have to have a very specific sort of lock for that key to open up, meaning that if you have DHT, then ultimately it doesn't mean that you're necessarily going to lose hair because of it. You actually have to have the gene that will then create the sensitivity to the DHT. So at the end of the day, we're going to get into that a little bit more in detail, because DHT related loss only affects the top of the head. So it only affects basically the temples, the top of the scalp, the crown, the more traditional balding areas that people see. People are looking at, hey, I'm losing hair in my frontal hairline. Well, that's DHT related loss. Or, hey, I'm losing hair on the crown, also DHT related loss. Women actually lose a little bit of a spot. So just behind their frontal hairline, there's about an inch behind it. There is usually the epicenter for female pattern loss. And it's really noticeable because for women, obviously the frontal hairline, it frames your face, but they get this unusual spot and it's very uniform. So ultimately, if you can identify that you have DHT related loss, then you can treat it, because it's actually pretty simple to treat. So a couple key things about DHT related loss that is going to then understand for you if it's actually impacting you. So one, we already talked about it. It only affects the top of the head. So if you're losing more hair on the top of your head than the sides, it's probably impacting you. Additionally, you almost have to have a family history, because it is a genetic type of hair loss. So when you are looking up the family tree, you're looking at all sorts of different people up there. So it could be your grandparents, it could be a brother, uncle, somebody who's losing hair in that same pattern. Then you go, okay, well, it's possibly going to impact me. And realistically, men can inherit it from women, and women can inherit it from men, which is completely contrary to what you're told. Because as a male, you're told that you're going to inherit your hair loss gene from your mother's father. I don't know where that came from. Straight up not true. It's funny where some of the stuff comes from, and it just keeps proliferating through history. But so anybody up the family tree, you can get it from. So that is another key factor. So you've got, again, losing it on the top of your head. You've got a family history. And then there's really a timeline. So for men, anytime after the age of 18, realistically, male pattern loss will kick in. So it's really when your testosterone begins to peak after puberty that you are going to end up converting testosterone to dihydrotestosterone in abundance. So when that happens, so let's just say you're 18 years old, your total testosterone is 1,000, your DHT on a blood test is probably around 40. And it will actually increase over time. So genetically speaking, as you age, your propensity for increasing your DHT levels increases. So ironically, there's an inverse relationship. As a male, you'll end up actually having a less testosterone, but the reason for it is that more DHT is being converted into more testosterone is being converted into dihydrotestosterone. So that's for men. So anytime after the age of 18, you really become more susceptible. It's rare that it happens, at 18. Usually it's your early 20s, or more often than not, it's as your DHT increases, 30s, 40s, 50s, etc. So that's for men. For women, women have a different ecosystem. So women have the sort of the best portion of this is an elevated level of protection from estrogen. So estrogen is going to actually protect your hair follicles from DHT because your hair follicle receptors are trying to absorb hormones. And when they're doing that, it will take testosterone, but it wants estrogen. And so realistically, you end up then having this elevated level of protection as a female until your estrogen begins to decline. So you notice most women will not have hair loss until they get older. And older, I mean like 40s, really, 50 is sort of that peri or postmenopausal age where your estrogen and your testosterone actually drop off. But at the end of the day, really for women, they typically will not see female pattern loss or DHT related loss kick in until their early 30s, and realistically 35 is kind of like that cutting point where you really become very much susceptible thereafter. So, and that's because your estrogen has peaked and now it's beginning to decline, and then DHT becomes more of a factor. So now women, you're going to have that little spot usually just behind that frontal hairline where you're losing hair, and then it will actually branch out in oftentimes like a Christmas tree pattern. So from that frontal hairline back. But you might see general thinning right through the middle of the part line, and that is a factor that they're dealing with. I've seen women who have inherited it from men, and their frontal hairlines will go. And so they think that there's something wrong with them because the hair loss looks so unusual for a female, but it's just genetics. So it really, when you're looking at this and you're going, do I have DHT related loss? Do I have, the another name for it, androgenetic alopecia? Then you go, do I have a family history? Is this slow and gradual? Is this, basically loss in a typical pattern? And if all of those things check the box, then you need to know how to treat it, because if it's affecting you, the unfortunate thing about DHT related loss, it's one of the actual reasons for hair loss that you can't grow back after a certain period of time. So you have a window of approximately 3 years from when that hair follicle becomes so miniaturized or so small because of the impact of DHT that it literally atrophies away and becomes scalp. So when you see somebody who's totally bald, like there's no fuzz, there's nothing, they have been in the final stages of male pattern loss or female pattern loss in some cases for a very long time. And so once you get past that 3-year mark of total atrophy, then that hair follicle is not coming back. I don't care, what magic potion you think you're going to rub on your head to do so. It's just straight up not coming back. Basically the hair follicle dies and it becomes scalp. So you have to put it into perspective of what you can do. So realistically, you can go back in time 3 to 5 years. So, and the reason I say 5 is that the visual appearance of the miniaturization takes a long period. where you are sort of growing the hair out, and then it will actually fall out, and then it will go through a cycle of growing back again, and then it will actually grow smaller and finer. And then this process just repeats itself until eventually that hair is a centimeter long and it barely has any pigment. And realistically, it's in sort of that final legs of rehabilitation. People's perception of this might be that they've been losing hair for a very long period of time, but still the window is open because that hair follicle is not completely miniaturized. So at the end of the day, what do you do? And you go, well, I know I have male pattern loss or female pattern loss. What are my options? So men, it's very cut and dry, actually. So there's just so many things out there that say you can't grow your hair back, and it's just shenanigans because people just didn't know how to do it. And there's a lot of variables, but just when it comes to DHT, this is where you need to go. So for men, you can be very effective at blocking DHT by essentially not allowing DHT to be created in your blood. So what does that mean? Well, again, DHT is coming from testosterone. So there's an enzyme, and that enzyme is called 5-alpha reductase. That enzyme actually takes testosterone and converts it to dihydrotestosterone. So there is a drug, and that drug is called finasteride. It was known as Propecia for a very long period of time. Its trademark fell off. Now it's generic. But finasteride actually blocks the conversion of testosterone to dihydrotestosterone. So it does this throughout your entire body. And ultimately, it is going to block sometimes 55% of the DHT created. Now, since DHT is causing the hair loss for male or female pattern loss, this is great. You're decreasing your DHT, thus improving, or in many cases, stopping the progression of the loss completely. The problem is this: you're dealing with a systemic change in your hormonal equilibrium. So there are some pretty gnarly side effects for people who are going to be potentially using finasteride. It is far more effective for men than it is for women because of the amount of testosterone in your body. And realistically, it should only, in my opinion, be used under extreme circumstances. So we'll talk about that. So realistically, if you're taking finasteride, the plausible side effects are decreased libido, decreased ejaculate, and inability to maintain an erection. So no guy wants to deal with that. There are a lot of things on the internet about permanent side effects where people think that that this drug has then changed their DNA somehow, and now they're permanently impotent. I don't see how that's possible. I've never heard firsthand of that being possible, but you'll see it out there. So again, some pretty sketchy side effects. So that is a medical path of decreasing DHT. So it sounds scary, but it's effective. I mean, it really has changed the dynamic of male pattern loss for a lot of people. You can also put that in a topical form. It's not nearly as effective, but it does have some efficacy. Realistically, again, it's still finasteride. So everything that you put on your body will end up in your bloodstream, at least in a little way. So you need to be conscious of that regardless, especially if you're sensitive to it. So that's one path. So for men, we're still speaking about men. There is another path, and this is the path that I choose for most of my clients, is a more natural way of dealing with male pattern loss. So our primary goal is to diminish the impact of DHT on the hair follicle. This can be done in more of a natural way where you're not using a pharmaceutical. So in that case, you can use an internal DHT blocker. And so I particularly recommend Advanced Trichology, which is the DHT blocker with immune support, 2 in the morning, 2 at night with food. This product contains saw palmetto, stinging nettle, pygeum. These are sort of known herbs that help decrease the volume of the DHT impact on the hair follicle. It does not change how much DHT you have in your blood or in your body. It simply blocks the uptake of DHT into the hair follicle receptor. However, it is substantially less effective when it comes to blocking DHT impact in totality than finasteride because you're dealing with herbs. However, it doesn't come with side effects. So you have to balance these things out. So additionally, since it doesn't work as well as finasteride internally, topically is another opportunity for you to block DHT, because if you're dealing with blocking it a little bit internally and then you're dealing with blocking it externally, you're going to sort of add up to the same efficacy as finasteride, in my opinion. So there's another product topically that uses basically a host of different things. Melatonin topically is a key DHT blocker that is now being utilized because melatonin is actually a hormone. And when you're dealing with hormone receptors, or these little Pac-Men inside your hair follicle that are consuming hormones in your blood, then if you give it melatonin, it's not going to be as hungry to consume DHT. So it actually decreases, again, the uptake of DHT into the hair follicle. So now you've got a solution that's not a pharmaceutical. So it's an internal and external solution that, again, in my opinion, is as adequate as finasteride. And in some cases, it is more effective depending on how you receive it. Additionally, I've seen extreme male pattern cases where, a male is 18 years old. He's near bald. I mean, you're talking, he's a Norwood scale 4, and there's actually a scale. So if you're trying to figure out what I'm talking about in this regard, there's a scale of baldness, and it's called the Norwood scale. So you can Google it. But ultimately, in this scenario, I mean, I've got a kid, he was 17, 18. I mean, he was basically bald on the top of his head. In those circumstances, you can't just use natural. You have to get more aggressive than that. You've got to use the internal DHT blocker with immune support. You should use the topical melatonin, the Nutri-M, and then you should also use finasteride if you are trying to be as thorough as possible. If you use that big 3 in this regard, then you are going to basically do everything you possibly can as a male to block DHT. And it's just, that's all you can do. There's really nothing more that you can do, and that should mitigate it. If you've done all of those things and you're still losing hair, then there is a contributing factor that is either nutritional or inflammatory that additionally needs to be addressed. So again, we're only talking about DHT related loss today. So you must consider then, if you've done all that and you're still losing hair, then there's something else going on. So, and you can't just not treat DHT. That is a piece of the puzzle. So you have to continue treating DHT and then add the other components of treatment as well. So that's for men. For women, so women, again, have a different ecosystem. So you're dealing with a volume of estrogen that is, 20 or 50 times greater than a male. So you've got all of this extra estrogen to help protect against the dihydrotestosterone. So hypothetically, you get to age 35 and the female is beginning to lose hair in that part line, and it's just starting to digress. What do you do? Well, women, unfortunately, there's so many unique sets of hormonal just lifestyle factors that can create all sorts of problems that may come into play when you're trying to deal with it. But as just a very basic, removing those factors from the scenario, then they actually do really well with the natural versions of DHT blockers, simply because they have so much estrogen. Then women can utilize, say, the DHT blocker with immune support that I've talked about internally, and the Nutri-M or the melatonin topical externally. And that is oftentimes enough to control their DHT related loss, because they just don't have the testosterone that they have to fight off to deal with it like men do. So that's typically my recommendations, very blanket for a female pattern scenario, especially early on, especially at, let's say, age 35. So again, internal DHT blocker and external natural DHT blocker. Problem is over time that the estrogen declines to menopause. So at 35 is usually your peak of estrogen, then it begins to decline. You get to a point where you are, let's just say, 49. And so at 49 years old, you should be in perimenopause because the average age of menopause in the United States is 51. And so menopause, by definition, basically means you are no longer menstruating, you are no longer producing the normal volume of estrogen from your ovaries. And at that point, you cannot procreate, you are in menopause. So as your levels decrease, eventually your ovaries will stop producing estrogen almost completely. So now you've lost your protection. So at, say, age 51, most women will end up seeing some diminishment of volume. And that is due to directly to hormones. And so that estrogen protection's gone. Now your DHT is, what's left is kicking in. And you see a dramatic scenario of loss oftentimes. And so at that point, you might need to get a little bit more aggressive for somebody who is dealing with female pattern loss, or women may wait and they might not be as proactive early on as they should, because it is a lot easier to keep the hair that you have than grow it back. So if you are going through this and you're shedding rapidly as a female, then, and you know that you have female pattern loss because of the reasons that we've already talked about, then get on something to protect your hair. Again, Nutri-M topical melatonin is a topical application. It leaves no residue whatsoever. You can just apply it almost, like brushing your teeth. I mean, you can do it once or twice a day, and you just block that absorption of DHT and it protects you. And so you can maintain that hair longer. Or realistically, you can use a supplement to do the same thing. But that is the average scenario for a female. There are other components. So as women, because of the different aspects of hormones for women, you may have something called polycystic ovarian syndrome, or PCOS. And if you have PCOS, you actually have a lower estrogen typically, and you start throwing off tons of testosterone. So your testosterone could be 2 to 3 times higher than an average female. You'll also end up getting something called hirsutism. And hirsutism is a hairs growing in an abnormal way for women. So you end up seeing, all these little guys sort of growing on your chin, growing on your chest. And if you're a female dealing with that, then you probably are dealing with PCOS, or at least a much higher level of testosterone than you should be. And that will then create more DHT, which then obviously leads to a higher propensity for hair loss. So you need to have that sort of treatment and get aggressive with that. So you'd go obviously to your endocrinologist and get a series of tests for PCOS. So also women nowadays, especially in some of these more vanity driven areas, Phoenix, Arizona is one of them, Southern California, there's, parts of South Florida, that people are pushing hormone replacement. And there's nothing wrong with hormone replacement if it's done properly, and you take in cancer risks, et cetera. But really, women are getting now on hormone replacement, which contains testosterone. There is a hormone pellet, which is injected into a female or a male, depending on the situation, obviously. But for women, if you have a pellet with testosterone injected into you, and it's a sustained release for usually 90 to 120 days, and that testosterone peaks, you are going to go through a shed if you have female pattern loss. And I have sat in front of people that, I had a 65-year-old female that should have no testosterone at all, but her testosterone on paper was 400. To give you a comparison, at 42 years old, my testosterone is 590. So, and I'm a pretty fit 42-year-old. So she was competing with me on the volume of testosterone. So of course we had a very difficult time managing her hair loss because she had so much hormone replacement that it was an abnormal scenario causing extraordinary shedding and female pattern loss. So those are just the common ones. You can go into a super deep dive in a lot of these things. But to touch on one final topic for women. So when your testosterone is elevated like that, so if you do have PCOS, if you're on somehow hormone replacement that is spiking your testosterone above, say, 40 total testosterones, then you need to get it down. And so you need to get it down to that 40 range. And so to do that, there is a drug called spironolactone, and it is an anti-androgen and a diuretic. And so androgens are the entire class of things that I'm talking about: DHT, testosterone, DHEA. These are all androgens. So it helps suppress the androgens, which then puts your DHT in a more manageable zone. And so you end up having this really positive impact with the other products you're using, again, the natural products that now can work properly because your testosterone's not crazy high. So again, there's a lot of components. Everybody's an individual. And that is why hair loss is so difficult to manage, is that unless you know the components that are really affecting you, then it's challenging to understand what the next best path is. So this is my overview deep dive on DHT, because I could go down the rabbit hole on a million different topics related to DHT, but this is what you need to know when you're trying to identify it for yourself. So I really hope that helps and, really shed some light on things. I really want to help my listeners. So if you've got questions, you're going to be able to find this podcast, obviously, on YouTube. If you're watching it on YouTube and you have questions, please go ahead and leave a comment, ask a question. And so that YouTube channel is going to be William Gaunitz, Trichologist, obviously on YouTube. Please subscribe to this podcast on whatever podcast listening platform you're listening to it on. And ultimately, please, obviously, if you're enjoying it, give us a review. And in that review, if you want to add a comment or a question, I'm happy to answer it in any of the future episodes. So I hope that helps. Again, thank you so much for listening. And obviously, as always, this is William Gaunitz, the host of the Trichologist podcast, your no BS hair loss treatment